Sister Margaret knelt in the chapel of St. Catherine's Convent, her weathered hands clasped in prayer as the morning light filtered through stained glass windows. The 200-year-old building creaked gently around her, a testament to decades of faithful service to the community. For 30 years she had served as Mother Superior, watching over not just her fellow sisters, but also the countless women who had sought refuge within these walls. The convent had always been a sanctuary for those society deemed unwelcome, especially unmarried mothers who needed shelter, medical care, and compassion during their most vulnerable moments. The sound of footsteps echoed through the stone corridors, interrupting her meditation. Sister Margaret rose slowly, her knees protesting after years of countless hours spent in prayer and service. She made her way to the main office, where Sister Catherine waited with a troubled expression. In her hands was a thick envelope bearing the letterhead of Morrison Development Corporation, one of the city's most powerful real estate firms. The letter inside would change everything they thought they knew about their mission and their future. Morrison Development was offering the convent an unprecedented sum, $15 million, for the property and buildings. The offer was generous beyond imagination, enough to secure the sisters' retirement and establish a substantial endowment for their charitable work. It seemed like an answer to prayers they hadn't even dared to voice. But as Sister Margaret read further, her heart began to sink. Buried in the legal language was a condition that made her hands tremble. The developers wanted to purchase the property, but only if the convent agreed to cease all services to unmarried mothers immediately. They wanted the scandal-free reputation of a traditional religious institution to anchor their luxury residential development. The irony was crushing. They were being offered millions to abandon the very women who needed them most. Chapter 2. A History of Sanctuary. The weight of the proposal settled over Sister Margaret as she walked through the convent's halls, each room holding memories of lives transformed and hope restored. St. Catherine's had been serving unmarried mothers since the 1950s, when such women were routinely cast out by their families and communities. The sisters had provided not just shelter, but medical care, counseling, and most importantly, dignity to women society had deemed shameful. In the early days, the work had been done in virtual secrecy, with pregnant women arriving under cover of darkness and leaving through back entrances to avoid community judgment. But as social attitudes slowly began to shift, the convent had become more open about their mission. They had developed partnerships with local hospitals, social workers, and adoption agencies, creating a comprehensive support network that had helped thousands of women navigate impossible circumstances. Sister Margaret paused outside the nursery, where cribs lined the walls in neat rows. Some housed babies waiting for adoption, while others held infants whose mothers were taking time to make the most difficult decision of their lives. The sisters never pressured anyone toward a particular choice. Their role was simply to provide a safe space where women could think clearly, free from the chaos and judgment that had driven them to seek sanctuary. The financial reality of maintaining this mission had become increasingly challenging over the years. Government funding had dried up as political winds shifted, private donations had declined as attention turned to other causes, and the cost of maintaining a historic building continued to climb. The convent's bank account was often stretched thin, with the sisters sometimes going without necessities to ensure their residents had everything they needed. Now suddenly they were faced with an offer that could solve all their financial problems, but only by abandoning the women who needed them most. It felt like the ultimate test of faith, a choice between earthly security and spiritual calling. Chapter 3. The community pressure word of the development offer spread quickly through the local community, and the reactions were as divided as Sister Margaret had feared they would be. The small town surrounding the convent had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the sisters' work. Many longtime residents appreciated the historic significance of the convent and respected the sisters' dedication, but they had never been entirely comfortable with the constant presence of unmarried mothers in their midst. At the weekly town council meeting, the tension was palpable. Mayor Richardson spoke carefully about economic development opportunities and community advancement, but his underlying message was clear. The Morrison Development Project would bring jobs, tax revenue, and prestige to a town that had struggled economically for decades. The luxury homes planned for the site would attract wealthy families and raise property values throughout the area. "We have to think about what's best for the entire community," Mayor Richardson argued during the public comment period. "The convent has served its purpose, but times have changed. We have social services now, government programs. Do we really need a private institution doing this kind of work anymore?" His words stung Sister Margaret, who sat quietly in the back row, listening to neighbors debate the value of their life's work. But not everyone in the community supported the development plan. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had volunteered at the convent's medical clinic for years, stood to speak during the public comment period. "The sisters aren't just providing shelter," she said, her voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. "They're providing hope to women who have nowhere else to turn. Government programs have waiting lists, bureaucratic barriers, and stigma that these women can't afford to navigate when they're most vulnerable." The meeting ended without resolution, but the pressure was mounting. Local business leaders began making private visits to the convent, politely but firmly encouraging the sisters to consider their options. The implicit message was clear. The community wanted them to take the money and transform their mission into something more palatable. Chapter 4. The difficult decision. Sister Margaret called for a special meeting of all the sisters to discuss the Morrison development offer. The convent's chapel had never felt more solemn as 12 women gathered in a circle, their faces reflecting the gravity of the decision before them. Each sister had dedicated her life to serving others, and now they faced a choice that would define not just their own futures, but the futures of countless women who might need their help. Sister Catherine, the eldest among them at 78, spoke first. Her voice was fragile but determined as she shared her perspective. "I've been here for 52 years, she said slowly. "I've held babies whose mothers were barely more than children themselves. I've comforted women who had been thrown out of their homes for bringing shame to their families. How can we even consider abandoning that mission for money?" But Sister Mary, who managed the convent's finances, presented a different perspective. The reality was that they were struggling to keep the lights on. The building needed a new roof, the heating system was failing, and they had been forced to turn away women in need because they simply couldn't afford to house more residents. "What good are our principles if we can't actually help anyone?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. The debate continued for hours, with each sister wrestling with the moral complexity of their situation. They could take the money and use it to establish a different kind of ministry, perhaps opening a counseling center or providing financial assistance to women in need. But they would no longer be able to offer the immediate, unconditional sanctuary that had been their hallmark for decades. As evening approached, Sister Margaret asked for a period of silent prayer. The chapel fell completely quiet, except for the soft sound of breathing and the distant ticking of the ancient clock in the tower. In that silence, each woman searched her heart for guidance, knowing that whatever decision they made would echo through the lives of women not yet born, women who might someday need exactly the kind of refuge St. Catherine's had always provided. Chapter 5. Voices from the Past. Unable to sleep after the emotional meeting, Sister Margaret found herself drawn to the convent's archives, a small, dusty room where decades of records, letters, and photographs documented the lives that had been touched by their ministry. She pulled out box after box of correspondence, reading letters from women who had stayed at the convent years or even decades earlier. The stories were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Maria Santos had arrived in 1987, 18 years old and 7 months pregnant, after being disowned by her family. She had stayed at the convent for 3 months, giving birth to a daughter she ultimately chose to place for adoption. Her letter, written 5 years later, described how the sisters' support had enabled her to finish high school, attend college, and become a social worker herself. "You didn't just save my life," she had written. "You showed me that I had value even when the whole world told me I was worthless." Another letter came from Jennifer Walsh, who had arrived at the convent in 2003 with 2 young children and another baby on the way. Her husband had abandoned the family when he learned about the pregnancy, and she had nowhere else to turn. The sisters had provided not just housing but childcare so she could attend job training programs. Jennifer had eventually found work as a medical technician and was now raising 3 successful children as a single mother. "The convent gave me the breathing room I needed to figure out how to rebuild my life," her letter read. But perhaps the most moving correspondence came from Sarah Kim, a teenager who had arrived at the convent just 6 months earlier. Her parents had tried to force her to terminate her pregnancy, and when she refused, they had thrown her out of the house. Sarah had given birth to a son at the convent and was working with the sisters to develop a plan for her future. Her letter was simple but profound. "For the first time in months, I feel like I'm not alone." As Sister Margaret read through dozens of similar stories, the weight of their decision became even heavier. These weren't abstract moral principles they were debating. These were real women whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the sanctuary the convent provided. The $15 million from Morrison Development would disappear eventually, but the impact of abandoning their mission would last forever. Chapter 6. An Unexpected Alliance. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the convent. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the city's leading obstetrician and gynecologist, had heard about the development offer through her medical network and had come to speak with Sister Margaret directly. Dr. Rodriguez had referred dozens of patients to the convent over the years. Women facing difficult pregnancies complicated by poverty, domestic violence, or family rejection. "Sister Margaret," Dr. Rodriguez said as they sat in the convent's simple but comfortable parlor, "I don't think you realize how unique this place is. I've worked in cities across the country, and I've never seen anything like St. Catherine's. You provide something that hospitals, government agencies, and even other religious organizations can't: unconditional acceptance combined with practical support." She explained that she had been quietly organizing a coalition of medical professionals, social workers, and community advocates who were opposed to the Morrison Development Project. "We're not just talking about preserving a building," she said earnestly. "We're talking about preserving a lifeline that women in crisis desperately need. The services you provide here aren't duplicated anywhere else in the region." Dr. Rodriguez had brought with her a folder containing statistics that painted a stark picture of the need for the convent's services. The nearest equivalent facility was more than 200 miles away, and it had a 6-month waiting list. Government programs were overwhelmed and underfunded, with bureaucratic requirements that often excluded the most vulnerable women. "If St. Catherine's closes," Dr. Rodriguez concluded, "women will die. It's that simple." The coalition Dr. Rodriguez was organizing included some influential voices in the community, people who could potentially pressure the town council to reject the Morrison Development Project, or at least consider alternatives. But she needed the sisters to commit to staying and fighting for their mission, rather than taking the easy path of accepting the buyout offer. Sister Margaret felt a spark of hope for the first time since receiving the development offer. Perhaps they weren't as alone in this fight as she had believed. But she also knew that good intentions and moral support wouldn't pay for a new roof or fix the failing heating system. The financial reality of their situation remained unchanged. Chapter 7. The Developer's Pressure. Representatives from Morrison Development Corporation arrived at the convent the following week, dressed in expensive suits and carrying briefcases full of legal documents. James Morrison, the company's founder, was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm, persistence, and financial pressure. He had built his fortune by identifying undervalued properties and transforming them into luxury developments that catered to wealthy buyers. Morrison spoke respectfully to Sister Margaret, acknowledging the convent's long history of service while making his case for the development project. "Sister, I understand this is a difficult decision," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "But you have to consider the reality of your situation. This building is falling apart, your operating budget is insufficient, and the community is changing around you." He painted a picture of inevitable decline, years of struggling with inadequate funding, watching the building deteriorate further. and ultimately being forced to close anyway without the resources to continue their mission. At least this way, Morrison argued, you can leave with dignity and enough money to secure your futures. You could establish a foundation, provide scholarships, or support other organizations doing similar work. But then Morrison's tone shifted slightly, revealing the steel beneath his polished exterior. Of course, he continued, this offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. My investors are interested in this location specifically because of its history and reputation. If we can't reach an agreement, we'll simply find another location for our project. But I have to tell you, the community pressure for you to accept this offer is only going to increase. Sister Margaret felt a chill as she realized the implications of his words. Morrison wasn't just offering them money. He was orchestrating a campaign to make their lives increasingly difficult until they had no choice but to accept his terms. The community pressure he mentioned wasn't coincidental. It was part of a calculated strategy to force their hand. After Morrison and his team left, Sister Margaret sat alone in her office, staring at the legal documents they had left behind. The contract was even more detailed than the original offer letter, with specific timelines and penalties for delay. But buried in the fine print was language that would have prevented the sisters from establishing any similar ministry anywhere in the state. Morrison wasn't just buying their property. He was trying to buy their silence and ensure they could never compete with his vision of what their mission should be. Chapter 8. A Test of Faith. That evening, Sister Margaret found herself drawn once again to the chapel. But this time she wasn't alone. Sister Catherine joined her, along with several of the younger sisters who had been particularly troubled by the day's events. They knelt together in the familiar space, surrounded by the soft glow of votive candles and the comforting presence of the carved wooden crucifix that had watched over the convent for generations. I keep thinking about what Jesus would do, whispered Sister Mary, her voice barely audible in the sacred space. He never turned away the outcasts, the women's society condemned, but he also talked about being wise as serpents. How do we know when we're being faithful and when we're just being stubborn? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications none of them wanted to fully explore. They had all taken vows of poverty, obedience, and service, but those vows had always felt clear and straightforward before. Now they were being asked to choose between financial survival and moral principle, between earthly security and spiritual calling. Sister Catherine, who had remained silent for most of the recent discussions, finally spoke. Her voice was stronger than usual, filled with a conviction that surprised even her. I've been thinking about the parable of the talents, she said slowly. The master didn't give his servants money to bury in the ground for safekeeping. He gave it to them to use, to multiply, to put to work for good. She continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. What if our talent isn't the building or the money we might receive for it? What if our talent is our willingness to serve the most vulnerable members of society? If we take Morrison's money and abandon our mission, aren't we burying our talent in the ground? Her words resonated deeply with Sister Margaret, who had been struggling to separate practical concerns from spiritual calling. The convent had never been about the building itself. It had always been about the women who found refuge within its walls. But could they continue to provide that refuge without adequate funding or community support? As they prayed together in the gathering darkness, each sister felt the weight of decision settling more heavily on her shoulders. They were being asked to make a choice that would define not just their own futures, but the very nature of their faith. Chapter 9. The community fights back. Dr. Rodriguez's coalition had been working quietly but effectively to build opposition to the Morrison Development Project. What had started as a small group of medical professionals and social workers had grown to include teachers, clergy from other denominations, business owners, and even some local politicians who had begun to question whether the community was making the right choice. The breakthrough came when Sarah Kim, the teenage mother who had written to Sister Margaret just months earlier, agreed to speak at a town council meeting. Standing at the podium with her infant son in her arms, Sarah told her story with a quiet dignity that cut through all the political rhetoric and financial calculations that had dominated previous discussions. 6 months ago, I had nowhere to go, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the crowd of faces staring back at her. My parents had disowned me, my boyfriend had disappeared, and I was living in my car. I was seriously considering other options. She paused, the weight of unspoken words filling the room. The sisters at St. Catherine's didn't just give me shelter. They gave me hope when I thought I had none left. She continued, describing how the sisters had helped her complete her high school education, connected her with job training programs, and provided childcare so she could work toward independence. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me, she concluded. I'm asking you to understand that there are other young women out there right now who need what the sisters gave me. If you close the convent, where will they go? The impact of Sarah's testimony was immediate and powerful. Several council members who had previously supported the development project began asking harder questions about alternatives. Could the community find ways to support both economic development and the convent's mission? Were there other locations that might work for Morrison's luxury housing project? But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen, a local business owner whose family had lived in the community for 3 generations, stood to address the council. My grandmother came to this country with nothing, she said. She was pregnant and unmarried, and if it weren't for the sisters at St. Catherine's, I wouldn't be here today. We've been so focused on property values and tax revenue that we've forgotten what actually makes a community valuable. By the end of the meeting, the town council had voted to postpone any decision about the Morrison development project for 60 days, giving the community time to explore alternatives and the convent time to develop a long-term sustainability plan. Chapter 10. Finding a Different Path. The 60-day reprieve gave Sister Margaret and her coalition the breathing room they needed to explore creative solutions to their financial crisis. Rodriguez had connected them with a nonprofit consultant who specialized in helping religious organizations develop sustainable funding models, and the results of that consultation had been surprisingly hopeful. The consultant had identified several potential revenue streams that could help the convent maintain its mission while achieving financial stability. Medical professionals in the region were willing to pay fair market rates for the specialized services the convent provided: prenatal care, counseling, and postnatal support that wasn't available elsewhere. Insurance companies, it turned out, were interested in covering these services because they prevented more expensive emergency interventions later. Additionally, the convent's reputation for providing excellent care had attracted the attention of several major foundations that funded organizations serving vulnerable women. Grant applications that had been rejected in the past were suddenly being reconsidered as the convent's unique model gained recognition from the nonprofit sector. Perhaps most importantly, the community organizing effort had revealed a deep well of local support that had been largely invisible before the crisis. Dozens of families had quietly benefited from the convent's services over the years, and many of them were now willing to provide financial support to ensure those services continued. Sister Margaret felt cautiously optimistic as she reviewed the financial projections the consultant had prepared. They wouldn't be rich, but they could be sustainable. The building repairs that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier now appeared manageable through a combination of grants, donations, and increased service fees. Most crucially, they could maintain their mission of serving unmarried mothers while also expanding their services to include other vulnerable women in need. But the plan required them to reject Morrison's offer definitively, burning the bridge to financial security that the development deal represented. It was still a leap of faith, still a choice to trust in their mission rather than their bank account balance. Chapter 11. The Final Decision. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 months after receiving Morrison Development Corporation's original offer, the Sisters of St. Catherine's Convent gathered one final time to make their decision. The chapel was filled with golden light streaming through the stained glass windows, and the familiar space felt more sacred than ever as 12 women prepared to choose their future. Sister Margaret stood before her sisters, holding 2 documents. In her left hand was the Morrison contract, with its promise of $15 million and financial security. In her right hand was the sustainability plan developed by their coalition, with its promise of continued service to vulnerable women, but no guarantee of easy success. "We've prayed about this decision for months," Sister Margaret said, her voice steady but emotional. "We've listened to our community, to the women we serve, and to our own hearts. Each of us has to live with whatever choice we make, not just for ourselves, but for all the women who might need our help in the years to come." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was clear. By a margin of 10-2, the sisters chose to reject Morrison's offer and commit themselves to the uncertain but faithful path of continuing their mission. Sister Mary and Sister Elizabeth, the two dissenting votes, expressed their concerns about the financial risks they were taking, but they pledged to support whatever decision the community made. That afternoon, Sister Margaret called James Morrison to inform him of their decision. His response was predictably cold and professional, but she could hear the frustration in his voice as he warned her that she was making a mistake that would ultimately harm the very women she claimed to want to help. "You'll be back," Morrison said before ending the call. "When your roof caves in and your heating system fails, when you're turning away women because you can't afford to house them, you'll realize that good intentions don't pay bills." But Sister Margaret felt more confident in their choice than she had in months. That evening, as she walked through the halls of the convent, she could hear the sounds of life continuing around her. Babies crying, women talking quietly in the common room, the soft voices of sisters leading evening prayers. The building might be old and in need of repair, but it was alive with purpose and meaning in ways that no luxury development could ever replicate. 3 months later, Sarah Kim stood in the same chapel where the sisters had made their decision, but this time she was wearing a graduation cap and gown. She had completed her GED and been accepted to community college with a scholarship sponsored by the coalition that had formed to support the convent. Her son, now walking and babbling constantly, toddled between the pews as the small graduation ceremony concluded. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Sister Margaret after the ceremony ended. "Not just for the shelter and the food, but for believing that I was worth saving." Sister Margaret hugged the young woman tightly, knowing that moments like these made all the financial uncertainty worthwhile. The convent's future remained challenging, with grant applications to write, fundraising events to organize, and repairs to complete. But they faced those challenges with their mission intact and their faith stronger than ever. They had chosen compassion over comfort, service over security, and in doing so, they had preserved something precious that no amount of money could have replaced.